Of course, the most famous stories about Julie Dominy were her offstage adventures, but being an opera singer was also a huge part of her life. So today I want to talk about what it was like to be an opera singer in 17th century Paris. First, at the Paris Opera, Julie Daubigny was always known as Mlle Maupin, even though Maupin was her married name, because all the women at the opera were always called Mademoiselle, regardless of if they were married. Second, what did opera singers do? Well, similar to today, they would have spent a lot of their time rehearsing, practicing and memorizing their music, and then performing. One little tidbit that was often written about Maupin was that she couldn't actually read music, but she had such a great memory that she could make up for it in rehearsals. Now that would be very unusual today. Professional opera singers have to be able to learn roles very quickly and be able to teach it to themselves from a score. But similar to today, opera singers in the 17th century would have rubbed elbows with the wealthy elite of society. Opera is expensive, and so throughout history there's almost always been patrons or donors paying for it, and often pulling a few strings behind the scenes. For Maupin, this would have been King Louis XIV and his court of aristocrats. Maupin actually performed several times for the royal court at Versailles, and nobility would have been the majority of the audience at the opera in Paris. At the time, the opera rehearsed and performed at the Palais Royal, and it was officially called l'Académie Royale de Musique, or in English, the Royal Academy of Music. So it was very much a royal institution, even though by the time Maupin was working there, King Louis XIV had kind of lost interest in opera as an art form. But other royals and nobles were still very passionate patrons and connoisseurs. One big difference from today is that being an opera singer was not at all considered a respectable profession. Especially for women, any kind of professional performance was seen as immoral and marked them as fallen women. Actors were even officially excommunicated from the Catholic Church, which meant that if they wanted to have a church burial before their death, they had to repent of their great sin of acting. This is actually one of the reasons that Maupin was able to get away with being as openly queer and gender nonconforming as she was. As an actor, she was already kind of existing outside of polite society. And especially as a famous soloist, she would have been making enough money to support herself without having to rely on a husband, a father, or another male family member. And this gave her the independence to live life on her own terms. Of course, it also helped that if anyone had a problem with how she dressed or who she slept with, she could just challenge them to a duel. What was the music like? Like a lot of opera today, the music mostly consisted of soloists singing with an orchestra. The French opera orchestra at the time was usually 5-part strings with a few wind instruments and sometimes some percussion, especially for special effects like thunder or storms. Within an opera, there were sections that were more lyrical and melodic, and there were other sections called recit, or récit in French, that were a little bit more speech-like, and those would have been accompanied not by the full orchestra, but by a smaller group of instruments, so that the performer had a little bit more freedom to stretch time and do a little bit more acting. If these examples sound unusual, even if you are familiar with other types of opera, that's on purpose. French opera at the time was very intentionally set apart from other traditions of opera, in particular Italian. It was very much influenced by French spoken tragedies, and composers tried very hard to follow the natural rhythms of speech. The melodies were generally less vocally elaborate than Italian opera at the time, with more emphasis on character and drama and text. There was also more of a focus on long dance interludes, including solo dances, group dances, and sung choruses. One big difference between the opera industry then and now is that in Maupin's day, the vast majority of operas were brand new. There were sometimes revivals of older operas, but even those were only a few decades old. This is in contrast to the modern opera repertoire, which is dominated by operas from centuries ago. And you're lucky if a mainstream opera company has even one new opera in a whole season. So this meant that singers like Maupin far more often had roles written specifically for them, rather than almost always taking on roles that were already written. But this didn't mean that roles were that vocally different depending on the singer they were written for. The hierarchy of the Paris Opera was complicated and quite strict, and people needed to fill in for each other sometimes, so roles had to be written so almost anyone could sing them. And this is interesting because even though Maupin was often called a contralto, which refers to the lowest female voice type, the roles that were written for her were mostly written in this normal medium-ish range. There is one story about her transposing down a role when she had to fill in for another singer, but it's hard to confirm. And we'll talk more about that later. What kind of roles did Maupin play? Like most singers at the Paris Opera, she started out with small roles when she started with the company in 1690. But even then, her characters seemed to reflect her particular flavor of androgyny. For example, she played Athena, the goddess of war, and Diana, the goddess of the hunt. Later in her career, she graduated to leading roles and often played warrior princesses and evil sorceresses. A question I love to ask, even though we'll probably never know the answer, is whether Maupin's real life affected how audiences saw her characters on stage. Her dueling, her many affairs, and her habit of cross-dressing would all have been well-known gossip. And composers would have known they were writing specifically for her because of the strict hierarchical system of emploi and ranks. At the Paris Opera, they used a system of emploi, or character types, borrowed from French spoken theater. This system developed in part because it was helpful for theaters with a large fixed company of performers who had to be cast in different plays throughout a season. Emploi were specific character types that were easily identifiable in different plays and operas. When a new performer joined an acting troupe or a theater, they would be assigned an emploi based on their physical and vocal characteristics, as well as their particular acting strengths. The emploi assigned to an actor was, in theory, connected to certain innate qualities about them as a person, rather than just their physical appearance, which is more how we think about typecasting today. To the 17th century mind, the system was not as arbitrary as it might seem to us. Actors of that time used a less psychological method of acting. They weren't really trying to create realistic, well-rounded characters. They were more looking to embody an idealized stock character type. If you've ever learned about commedia dell'arte, it's a little bit like that. You've got really recognizable stock characters like the young lovers, the trickster, the crotchety old man, and so on. For women at the opera, there were 3 categories of emploi. Number 1, rôle tendre. This is an archetype we still have in some form or another, the tragic, innocent female love interest. This character basically exists to be tragically in love, and they were so associated with sorrow and weeping that this emploi was instantly recognizable on stage because they were always carrying around a huge handkerchief as a prop. Number 2, rôle furieux. These were women who were not necessarily always villains, but definitely less innocent than the rôle tendre. They were usually a little older, maybe queens instead of princesses, and they embodied a lot of societal fears about women with power. Generally, they are women who either have power or try to seize power, but are somehow betrayed by their innate femininity and emotionality. Their typical prompt is a baguette in French, which translates to wand, because these women were often also witches or sorceresses. But it wasn't a cute little fairy godmother wand. We're talking a big old stick, more like a royal scepter.
Venez, venez, secondez mes désirs, et vous transformez-vous en d'aimables zéphyrs. Venez, venez, secondez mes désirs, et vous transformez-vous en d'aimables zéphyrs. Que c'est à ce vainqueur, la pitié me surmonte, cachez ma faiblesse et ma honte dans les plus reculés déserts. Allez, allez, conduisez-nous au monde de l'univers. Allez, allez, conduisez-nous au monde de l'univers.
Number 3, comic roles. These were often smaller roles assigned to less senior singers, but interestingly, Maupin continued to sing these roles throughout her career at the opera. Their associated prop was either a fan or a shepherd's crook if it was set in the countryside. These typical props were so ingrained in the French opera tradition that it was considered very unusual for a singer to appear without them on stage. There's actually a famous quote about Maupin explaining that she was such a good actor that she was comfortable without anything in her hands while she was performing. Mlle Maupin appeared without a wand, without a handkerchief, and without a fan, which were indispensable accessories. But Mlle Maupin was hardly embarrassed by her hands. The habit of wearing a male costume gave her a special ease. Now, you might expect that considering Maupin's offstage antics and temperament, she would have been a shoo-in for the rôle furieux. But actually, Maupin was only ever the top-ranked soloist for rôle tendre. A great example of one of these roles is Clorinde in the opera Tancrède, which was written specifically for Maupin. This is often considered Maupin's most beloved and successful role. Clorinde is a warrior princess, and in classic rôle tendre form, she's in love with a man who does love her back, but they're separated by tragic circumstances. In this case, they're on opposite sides of a war. And of course, Clorinde dies in his arms at the end.
Que je suis faible encore, je m'arrête à me plaindre, quand je devrais d'orgueil seconder les premiers. Allons, oh, que pour moi c'est un stade et un craindre. Oserais-je paraître aux yeux de mes sujets? J'aime, c'est peu d'aimer, je montre ma tendresse. J'aime mon ennemi, j'ose le déclarer. Nos guerriers ont vu ma faiblesse. Partons, courons la réparer.
Now, in the hierarchy of the company, Maupin was ranked first in rôle tendre, but she was also ranked second in rôle furieux. which means that if the first soloist in that category had to miss a performance for any reason, Maupin was the one to step in. And this was how she performed the title role in Armide. Armide is also a warrior princess, but as a rôle furieux, she's embodying a very different stereotype. She is also in love with her enemy, but he does not like her back. And this archetype shows up a lot in French opera. The desperately in love woman who's rejected and then lashes out and makes a mess of things because she's just too emotional and illogical.
Parmi tous mes captifs sont sortis d'esclavage, qu'il éprouve toute ma rage. Quel trouble me saisit, qui me fait hésiter. Qu'est-ce qu'en sa faveur la pitié veut dire? Frappons, ciel, qui peut m'arrêter? À chevaux, je frémis. Vengez-nous, je soupire. Est-ce ainsi que je dois me venger aujourd'hui? Ma colère s'éteint quand j'approche de lui. Plus je le vois, plus la vengeance est vaine. Mon bras tremblant se refuse à ma haine. Oh, quelle cruauté lui ravit le jour. À ce jeune héros tout seul sur la terre. Qui croirait qu'il finisse le mot pour la guerre? Il semble être fait pour l'amour. Ne puis-je me venger à moins qu'il me périsse? Et ne suffit-il pas que l'amour le punisse, puisqu'il a pu trouver mes yeux assez charmants, qu'il m'aime moi par mes enchantements, que s'il se peut, je l'haïsse.
This production was a revival of an older opera by the composer Jean-Baptiste Lully. He had actually died by the time of this production, but he was generally considered to be the creator of French opera as a genre, which is kind of hilarious because he was Italian. What's important is that he was seen as this operatic genius, and his operas were revived for decades after his death. And this is where we get to the transposition scandal. Maupin had to step in for the first soloist to sing Armide, and there's some anecdotal evidence that she transposed it down to make it more comfortable for her to sing. And of course, there were some opera purists who were outraged by this. But personally, as a mezzo, I support it. Again, one of the unique things about Maupin's career at the Paris Opera is that she consistently sang roles from all three emplois. Generally, a singer would start out with smaller roles, including comic roles, and then kind of graduate to one of the two more mature emplois of tendre or furieux. But Maupin sang all three types throughout her career. One of Maupin's most prominent comic roles was the role of La Folie. This role sits squarely in the coquette stereotype. La Folie is very strong-willed and sexually forward, so girl boss, but she's also depicted as very chaotic and illogical, so kind of a precursor to the manic pixie dream girl. She flat out refuses to marry her lover, even though she does have feelings for him, and the only reason she does end up marrying him is because her parents forbid it, and then she does it out of spite. And of course, there's lots of silly shenanigans along the way.
E portarono quel diletto che si prova nell'amor. E portarono quel diletto che si prova nell'amor. E portarono quel diletto che si prova
Maupin's very last role was Isabelle in La Vénitienne in 1705. This was also a comedic role, and it was specifically a cross-dressing role. Now, this is different than a true trouser role where a female performer plays a male character, which was much more common in Italian opera at the time and later in French opera in the 19th century. But there really aren't any true trouser roles in French opera from Maupin's time. So in this role, Maupin is still playing a woman, but her character disguises herself as a man for part of the opera. And this type of plot was very common for French spoken comedy at the time, although less common in opera. Which actually makes me wonder if this role was written for Maupin as a little bit of a wink to the audience. Because they would definitely have known that she liked to dress up in men's clothes in her real life. But I'm actually planning to make a whole video about this specific opera and how it plays with gender, so I won't say too much here. One of the most interesting things for me about Maupin as a performer is that she played such wildly different roles, and yet all of them kind of reflect a part of her real-life persona. Clochinde is a tender romantic heroine, but she's also a warrior with a big sword. Armide is very feminine, but she's also powerful and volatile and violent. La Folie is wild and promiscuous, and of course, Isabelle is dressed as a man for a good part of the opera. No one role sums up all of Maupin, but taken together, I feel like they can give us a pretty clear image of who Maupin was as a person, at least based on the patchy historical records we have about her. Thank you to everyone watching this. I know if you're watching it's because you're supporting our film about Maupin's life. Thank you, and I can't wait to share it with you.